The 6th of June, 1944, dawned gray and cold over the Normandy coastline. But nothing could have prepared the German defenders for the mechanical thunder that was about to roll off the beaches. As dawn broke through the overcast sky, the first waves of Allied infantry scrambled across the blood-soaked sands of Omaha and Utah beaches. But it was what followed them that would forever change the face of armored warfare in Europe. Hundreds of American Sherman tanks, roaring out of the surf like steel leviathans, emerging from the deep. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter of the 716th Infantry Division had been manning his position overlooking Omaha Beach since 3 o'clock that morning when the naval bombardment began. He had survived the First World War as a boy soldier, and nothing in his 2 decades of military experience had prepared him for what he witnessed that day. Through the smoke and chaos, he watched as strange, ungainly tanks crawled out of the water itself, their treads churning sand and seawater, spitting fire from their 75mm guns. These were the Sherman DD tanks, duplex-drive amphibious vehicles that could float using canvas flotation screens before dropping them to fight as conventional tanks. The German High Command had anticipated an invasion, of course. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had spent months fortifying the Atlantic Wall, convinced that the Allies would strike at Normandy, despite Hitler's insistence that Pas-de-Calais was the more logical target. But what the Germans had not anticipated was the sheer scale of American industrial might that would pour onto French soil. According to historical accounts documented by the United States Army Center of Military History, the initial invasion force included over 700 Sherman tanks of various configurations, a number that would grow to thousands in the following weeks. The M4 Sherman medium tank, named after American Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, had earned a mixed reputation by mid-1944. Standing just 9 feet tall and weighing 30 tons, it was lighter and less heavily armored than its German counterparts, the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks. American tank crews had begun calling their Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter company because they lit up every time when struck by German anti-tank rounds. The Sherman's relatively thin, armor-only 3 inches at its thickest point, made it vulnerable to the high-velocity guns of German tanks and the dreaded 88mm anti-aircraft guns that had been repurposed as tank killers. Yet what the Sherman lacked in armor and firepower, it more than compensated for in numbers, reliability, and versatility. While Germany struggled to produce a handful of Tigers and Panthers each month, American factories churned out thousands of Shermans. Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant alone could assemble a complete Sherman tank every hour at peak production. This industrial advantage would prove decisive in the coming months. But on that first terrible day at Normandy, it was simply about getting enough armor onto the beaches to support the infantry pinned down by German machine gun fire. By the 10th of June, 1944, the Allied beachhead had been secured, but the real test of the Sherman tank and its crews was just beginning. Beyond the beaches lay the Norman Bocage nightmarish landscape of ancient hedgerows, sunken roads, and small fields that would turn into a tanker's hell. These hedgerows, some dating back to Roman times, consisted of earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense thickets of trees and brambles, often centuries old. The roots had turned the earth into walls as solid as concrete, creating a natural fortress that favored the defender. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 2nd Panzer Division quickly recognized that the Bocage neutralized many of the Sherman's advantages. The narrow lanes between the hedgerows became killing zones, where a single well-placed German tank or anti-tank gun could hold up an entire American column. When a Sherman attempted to climb over a hedgerow, its thin belly armor, less than an inch thick in places, became exposed to German Panzerfaust rockets and mines. The first attempts at breaching the Bocage resulted in catastrophic losses. Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron witnessed the slaughter firsthand during the battle for St. Lay in mid-June. His unit lost 4 Shermans in a single afternoon, each one picked off as it crested a hedgerow with its vulnerable underbelly exposed. "We were sitting ducks," he later recalled in interviews preserved by the National World War II Museum. "The Germans knew exactly where we'd have to come through, and they'd wait with their 88s and Panzerfausts. Sherman didn't stand a chance going over those banks." But American ingenuity proved as formidable as American industry. Cullen, working with fellow tankers and some creative engineering officers, developed what would become known as the Rhino, or Cullen cutter, a set of steel prongs welded to the front of a Sherman tank that could cut through the hedgerows like a knife through butter. The steel for these devices came from an unlikely source: the German beach obstacles that had failed to stop the invasion. Within weeks, thousands of Shermans were equipped with these jury-rigged devices, and the bocage, while still deadly, became navigable. The German defenders, meanwhile, were experiencing their own crisis. Panzerleutnant Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace who would survive the war with over 150 tank kills to his credit, wrote in his memoir that the sheer number of Shermans was overwhelming. "We could destroy 5, 10, even 15 of them," he noted, "but there were always more. Always more." The German doctrine of quality over quantity, which had served them well in the early years of the war, was crumbling in the face of American mass production. By the end of June 1944, the tactical situation in Normandy had become a brutal calculus of attrition. A single German Tiger or Panther tank could indeed destroy multiple Shermans before being knocked out. Often, the ratio was 5-1 or worse in the Germans' favor. But the Americans could afford those losses. Germany could not. The 20th of July 1944 brought Operation Goodwood, the British-led armored assault east of Caen, and with it came the harsh reality of tank versus tank combat in Normandy. While primarily a British and Canadian operation, American tank crews watched and learned as their allies. Shermans nearly identical to their own faced German armor in the open terrain south of Caen. The results were sobering. In 3 days of fighting, the British lost over 400 tanks, many of them Shermans, to a German force that was outnumbered 10-1. Lieutenant Colonel William Buster, of the 3rd Armored Division, had been analyzing combat reports since the invasion began, and the numbers told a disturbing story. In a direct confrontation with a German Panther tank, which mounted a high-velocity 75mm gun with superior armor penetration, Sherman had to get within 300 yards to have a reasonable chance of penetrating the Panther's frontal armor. The Panther, meanwhile, could kill a Sherman at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. Against the Tiger, with its dreaded 88mm gun and armor up to 7 inches thick, the disparity was even worse. The American response to this tactical disadvantage was characteristically practical. If they could not match German tanks gun for gun, they would overwhelm them with numbers, combined arms tactics, and aggressive maneuvering. The Sherman's advantage is a 5-man crew with better ergonomics than German tanks, a gyrostabilizer that allowed it to fire accurately while moving, and a powered traverse turret that could rotate faster than any German tank were exploited to the fullest. American tank doctrine emphasized speed and flanking maneuvers rather than frontal assaults. General George Patton's Third Army, which became operational in France on the 1st of August, 1944, embodied this philosophy. Patton cared little for the technical inferiority of his Shermans compared to German armor. "I'd rather have a good tank commander in a Sherman than a poor one in a Tiger," he reportedly told his officers. His emphasis on aggressive action, speed, and exploitation of breakthroughs meant that his tank units rarely got bogged down in the kind of static warfare that favored the Germans' superior armor and guns. According to research compiled by the United States Army's Armored School at Fort Knox, the key to Sherman's success in Normandy was not individual tank superiority, but combined arms integration. American tanks rarely fought alone. They were supported by tank destroyers like the M10 Wolverine and M18 Hellcat, which mounted high-velocity guns specifically designed for killing enemy armor. They fought alongside artillery that could be called in within minutes, and they operated under skies increasingly dominated by Allied fighter bombers that terrorized German armor with rockets and bombs. The German perspective on these combined arms tactics was one of grudging respect mixed with frustration. General Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded Panzer Group West during the Normandy campaign, later stated in Allied interrogations that while his tanks were superior in direct combat, they could rarely exploit this advantage. "Your tanks were never alone," he told his interrogators. "Always there were the fighter bombers, always the artillery. We could not maneuver without being observed and attacked from the air." The 25th of July, 1944, exploded with the fury of Operation Cobra, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's breakout offensive from the Normandy hedgerows. The operation began with the most concentrated aerial bombardment yet seen in support of ground forces over 2,000 heavy bombers carpeting a 5-mile-wide corridor with more than 4,000 tons of explosives. When the Shermans of the 1st Infantry Division and the 2nd Armored Division rolled forward through the devastated German lines, they found an enemy stunned, disorganized, and ripe for exploitation. Major General Maurice Rose's 2nd Armored Division spearheaded the breakthrough. Its Sherman tanks racing through gaps in the German line at speeds the ponderous German armor could not match. The Sherman's maximum road speed of 30 miles per hour was not impressive by later standards. But it was faster than the Tiger, which topped out at 23 miles per hour on roads and could barely manage 10 miles per hour cross-country. More importantly, the Sherman's mechanical reliability meant it could maintain that speed for hours or even days without breaking down, something German tanks, with their over-engineered and fragile transmissions, could not do. Sergeant Lafayette Poole of the 3rd Armored Division became one of the war's most successful American tank commanders during this period, and his story illustrates how experienced Sherman crews could overcome their technical disadvantages. Poole's tank, which he named In the Mood, would destroy over 258 German vehicles, including at least 12 tanks, before Poole was wounded in September. His tactics were simple but effective. Use the Sherman's speed to close distance rapidly, use its stabilized gun to fire while moving, and aim for the enemy's weaker side and rear armor, rather than attempting frontal penetrations. The German defenses in Normandy were crumbling under the weight of American armor, artillery, and air power. General Marschall Gunther von Kluge had replaced the wounded Rommel as commander of German forces in France, reported to Hitler that his panzer divisions were being destroyed piecemeal. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had fielded over 120 tanks at the start of the Normandy campaign, was down to fewer than 30 operational vehicles by the end of July, and these surviving tanks were increasingly isolated, cut off from fuel and ammunition by Allied air attacks on supply columns. The Sherman's logistical advantages were becoming as important as its numerical superiority. While a Tiger tank consumed almost 2 gallons of fuel per mile and required hours of maintenance for every hour of operation, the Sherman was relatively fuel-efficient and remarkably easy to maintain. American tank crews could perform most routine maintenance themselves, while German tanks often required specialized technicians and equipment that were increasingly unavailable as Allied air power destroyed German supply networks. By the 1st of August 1944, Patton's Third Army was unleashed into Brittany and began its historic race across France. The Sherman tank, so maligned by its crews for its vulnerability to German guns, was proving itself the ideal vehicle for exploitation warfare. Tired German divisions were bypassed and cut off as columns of Shermans rolled east, south, and north in a series of sweeping armored thrusts that left the Germans reeling. The Battle of Normandy was entering its final phase, and the despised Ronson was proving to be exactly the tank America needed. The 8th of August, 1944, marked the beginning of Operation Totalize, the Canadian polished drive toward Falaise that would help seal the fate of German forces in Normandy. American Sherman tanks of the 2nd French Armored Division and the 5th Armored Division were driving north from Le Mans, while British and Canadian forces pushed south from Caen. Between them, nearly 50,000 German soldiers and the remnants of multiple panzer divisions were trapped in what would become known as the Falaise Paqueta killing ground, where Sherman tanks would help write the final chapter of the Normandy campaign. Oberst-Lieutenant Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division found himself caught in this rapidly closing pocket with what remained of his command, fewer than 20 operational tanks, a few hundred exhausted infantrymen, and almost no fuel or ammunition. His division had entered Normandy with over 150 tanks and 12,000 men. In his post-war memoir, documented by military historians, von Luck described the nightmarish experience of being hunted by roving packs of American and British tanks while Allied fighter bombers circled overhead like vultures. The Sherman crews who fought in the Falaise pocket witnessed scenes of destruction that exceeded anything yet seen in the war. Staff Sergeant Earl Reeves of the 6th Armored Division described roads choked with burning German vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. "We didn't even have to fight most of the time," he recalled. "The Krauts were just trying to get away, and our tanks would catch them on the roads. It was like shooting fish in a barrel." His tank unit destroyed over 40 German vehicles in a single day without taking a loss. But the fighting was not entirely one-sided. German forces trapped in the pocket fought with desperate ferocity, and Sherman tanks continued to burn when caught by German anti-tank weapons. The Germans had deployed their feared 88mm flak guns in ground roll. creating defensive strongpoints that could destroy Shermans at extreme ranges. The town of Chambois, which sat astride one of the few remaining escape routes from the pocket, became the scene of particularly vicious fighting from the 18th to the 21st of August. During this period, a significant engagement occurred that highlighted both the weaknesses and strengths of the Sherman tank. Lieutenant Richard Barron of the 90th Infantry Division witnessed a single German Tiger tank hold up an entire American column for over 6 hours near the town of Argentan. The Tiger, commanded by SS Oberscharfer August Muller, destroyed 11 Shermans before it was finally knocked out by coordinated fire from multiple directions. Perfect example of the kill ratio the Germans achieved in favorable circumstances. Yet this tactical victory meant nothing strategically. The delay had allowed American artillery to be brought forward, and when the Tiger was finally destroyed, the advance continued over its burning hulk. By the 21st of August, 1944, the Falaise pocket had been sealed and then crushed. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers had been killed, and 50,000 more captured. Over 500 German tanks and assault guns had been destroyed or abandoned, losses from which the German army in France would never recover. The Shermans that had helped achieve this victory were battered and worn. Many sporting scars from German anti-tank rounds that had struck but failed to penetrate, but they were still operational and ready to advance. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Survivors of the Falaise pocket spoke of feeling utterly helpless against the combination of Allied air power, artillery, and armor. The Sherman tank, which they had initially dismissed as inferior to German armor, had become a symbol of Allied material superiority and inexorable advance. The 25th of August, 1944, saw the liberation of Paris, and with it came a moment for the Allied High Command to assess the lessons of the Normandy campaign. The Sherman tank had proven itself, but at a terrible cost. American armored divisions had suffered approximately 18,000 casualties in the 10 weeks of fighting since today, and over 4,000 tanks had been knocked out or destroyed. Yet the Sherman had accomplished its mission. It had helped break Hitler's Atlantic Wall and driven the German army from France. General Jacob Devers, who commanded American ground forces in southern France, commissioned a study of tank effectiveness in the Normandy campaign. The results, preserved in the National Archives, painted a complex picture. In head-to-head engagements with German Panthers and Tigers, the Shermans' losses were indeed catastrophic, sometimes reaching 8 or 9 Shermans lost for every German heavy tank destroyed. But such engagements represented only a small fraction of actual combat. Most Sherman casualties came from anti-tank guns, mines, and Panzerfaust rockets fired by infantry, not from enemy tanks. The study also revealed something that surprised many critics of the Sherman. Its crew survivability was actually quite good compared to other tanks. While the Sherman's tendency to burn when penetrated had earned it a fearsome reputation, improvements made throughout the war had significantly reduced this problem. The introduction of wet stowage for ammunition storing, shells in water-jacketed containers had reduced the fire rate from over 80% to less than 20% when the tank was penetrated. Moreover, the Sherman's design featured good crew ergonomics and escape hatches that allowed crew members to bail out quickly when their tank was hit. Captain Nicholas Moschlinek, a medical officer with the 4th Armored Division, documented survival rates that contradicted the Sherman's reputation as a death trap. His record showed that approximately 85% of Sherman crews survived when their tank was knocked out, provided they were not struck by a catastrophic ammunition explosion. This compared favorably to German tanks, where crews often had difficulty escaping from their more cramped fighting compartments, especially in the Tiger and Panther with their awkward hull escape hatches. The Sherman's mechanical reliability continued to prove its worth as Allied armies raced across France in late August and early September. German panzer divisions that had survived Normandy found themselves unable to conduct sustained operations because their Tigers and Panthers were constantly breaking down or running out of fuel. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, retreating toward the German border, abandoned more tanks to mechanical failure than to enemy action. Meanwhile, American Sherman units were covering hundreds of miles in days, their tanks running smoothly on the excellent roads of eastern France. Innovations continued to improve the Sherman's combat effectiveness. The M4A3 variant, featuring the powerful Ford GAA V8 engine and a more durable final drive, began reaching frontline units in late August. This version could reach 30 miles per hour cross-country and had significantly improved reliability. More importantly, some units began receiving the Sherman EZ-8, the M4A3E8, which featured a new suspension system, wider tracks, and a more powerful 76mm gun that could finally penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther tank at combat ranges. By the 1st of September 1944, as Allied armies approached the German border, the verdict on the Sherman in the Normandy campaign was clear. It was not the best tank in the world, perhaps not even in the top 3, but it was the right tank for the job it had been asked to do. It was reliable, easy to produce, good enough to win when supported by the massive logistical and industrial system that America had created. The 10th of September 1944 found General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, sitting in a farmhouse near the German border, writing his after-action report on the Normandy campaign. His division, once considered the elite of the panzer forces, with 183 tanks and almost 16,000 men, had been virtually destroyed in Normandy. Only a handful of tanks and 2,000 men had made it back to Germany. In his report, later captured by Allied forces, Bayerlein gave grudging credit to American armored tactics and the Sherman tank that he had initially underestimated. The Americans do not fight with the technical excellence of the British or the fanatical determination we have seen in the Russians, Bayerlein wrote. But they fight with overwhelming material superiority and a pragmatic efficiency that is devastating. Their Sherman tank is inferior to our Panthers and Tigers in armor and firepower, but it appears in such numbers and is supported by such massive artillery and air power that our technical superiority becomes meaningless. We can destroy 5 of their tanks, and 2 more appear for every one we kill. SS Oberfuhrer Kurt Meyer, known as Panzer Meyer for his aggressive tank tactics, commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, during the Normandy campaign. His division fought with particular ferocity against Canadian forces equipped with Sherman tanks in the battles around Cannes. In post-war interviews, Meyer acknowledged that his initial confidence in German armor superiority had been misplaced. Yes, our Tigers could destroy their Shermans with ease, he stated. But we never had enough Tigers. Always we were outnumbered. Always we were short of fuel. Always the Jabos, their fighter bombers, were overhead. The Sherman was part of a system, and that system defeated us. The technical assessments from German tank commanders were more nuanced than simple comparisons of armor thickness and gun caliber suggested. Major General F.W. von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for 4th Panzer Army on the Eastern Front, but detailed to study Western Front operations, noted in his analysis that the Sherman's gyrostabilizer, which allowed it to fire accurately while moving, gave it a significant advantage in encounter battles. A moving Sherman could fire with reasonable accuracy while our tanks had to stop to shoot effectively, he observed. In the Bocage country, where engagement ranges were often less than 100 meters, this mobility advantage often decided the outcome. German assessments also noted the superior training and doctrine of American tank crews as the war progressed. Early in the Normandy campaign, German commanders had noted that American tankers often fought too cautiously and were too reliant on supporting arms. By August, however, this had changed dramatically. Lieutenant Heinrich Fischer of the 2nd Panzer Division wrote in his diary about an engagement near Mortagne, where American Shermans had attacked with what he called reckless aggression, using smoke, mutual support, and rapid maneuver to overwhelm his platoon's defensive position. These are not the same tankers we fought in June, he noted. They have learned quickly and fight with confidence. The German logistical perspective on the Sherman was perhaps most telling. Oberst Ulrich Weiss, a logistics officer with Army Group B, calculated that for every Tiger tank Germany could field, America could deploy more than 20 Shermans, and those Shermans would be better supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. We are losing this war in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh, he wrote to a colleague. Our tanks are magnificent machines, but they are machines we cannot produce in sufficient numbers, cannot adequately supply, and cannot replace when destroyed. By mid-September 1944, as German forces prepared to defend the Siegfried Line, the psychological impact of the Sherman had become as important as its physical presence. German soldiers who had survived Normandy spoke in their letters home not of individual tank encounters, but of the seemingly endless columns of American armor rolling across France. The Sherman had become a symbol of American industrial might and the futility of continued resistance. The 19th of September, 1944, saw the conclusion of the Normandy campaign, as military historians would later define it. With German forces having withdrawn behind the Siegfried Line, and Allied armies pausing to consolidate their supply lines after the spectacular dash across France. The Sherman tank's role in this achievement could now be properly assessed. And the verdict was complex, but ultimately vindicated the decisions made by American planners years earlier, when they had chosen to produce the Sherman in massive quantities rather than develop more sophisticated designs. The statistical record of the Normandy campaign painted a stark picture. American forces had landed approximately 5,000 Sherman tanks in France between June and September 1944. Of these, roughly 3,000 had been knocked out or destroyed, a 60% casualty rate that seemed catastrophic at first glance. But here was the critical point. The American industrial machine had already produced the replacements, and more Shermans were arriving every day. Germany, meanwhile, had lost approximately 450 Tigers and Panthers in the same period, losses they could never replace. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Historical research compiled by the United States Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, has thoroughly documented the Sherman's contribution to Allied victory in Normandy and beyond. The tank's design philosophy, emphasizing reliability, ease of production, and good enough performance rather than technical superiority, aligned perfectly with American strategic doctrine. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, would later write in his memoir that while he wished the Sherman had been better armed and armored, he never doubted that it was the right tank for America to build in mass quantities. The human costs of the Sherman's technical limitations cannot be ignored. Over 4,000 American tank crewmen were killed in action during the Normandy campaign. Many more were wounded or scarred by the experience of fighting in a tank they knew was outmatched by German armor. Yet these same crewmen achieved victory through courage, tactical innovation, and the knowledge that while they might lose individual battles against superior German tanks, they were winning the larger war. Staff Sergeant Bob Early of the 7th Armored Division perhaps said it best in a letter home written in September 1944. "Our tank isn't as good as theirs, but there's more of us than there are of them, and that's what counts." The German reaction to the Sherman evolved from initial dismissal to grudging respect to, finally, a kind of exhausted resignation. By September, German tactical manuals were advising their troops that destroying Sherman tanks was less important than avoiding being encircled. By the mobile American armored forces, the Sherman had become, in German eyes, less a weapon to be feared individually than a symbol of the massive industrial and logistical system that made American victory inevitable. The technical lessons learned from the Sherman's performance in Normandy would influence tank design for decades. The importance of reliability over raw performance, the value of a 5-man crew with good ergonomics, necessity of adequate escape hatches and fire suppression systems, and the advantages of a stabilized gun system. All these features of the Sherman would become standard in post-war tank designs. Even the Soviet Union, which had initially dismissed the Sherman as inadequate when they received thousands through Lend-Lease, incorporated many Sherman design features into their post-war tanks. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Sherman at Normandy was the validation of American military-industrial doctrine. The United States had chosen to fight World War II, not with small numbers of exquisite weapons, but with massive quantities of good enough equipment supported by overwhelming logistical superiority. The Sherman embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not the best tank of World War II. That distinction probably belonged to the German Panther or the Soviet T-35, but it was the right tank for the mission America asked it to perform. By the 1st of October 1944, as autumn rains began to fall on the battlefields of France and Belgium, the Normandy campaign had passed into history. The Sherman tanks that had rolled off the beaches in June stunned the German defenders with their numbers and versatility, survived the nightmare of the bocage, and pursued the retreating Wehrmacht across France, were now veterans of one of history's decisive campaigns. They had proven that in modern warfare, quantity backed by quality logistics could overcome individual qualitative superiority. The German troops, who had initially been confident in their technical superiority, had learned a harsh lesson. In total war, The factory is as important as the battlefield, and the nation that can produce 20 adequate tanks will defeat the nation that can produce one superior tank. This was America's Sherman tank, perfect, vulnerable, but ultimately victorious, and it had forever changed the face of armored warfare.